15 Shocking Details About the 4 on the Floor Murders, Part 2. If you are brand new to our channel, we invite you to take a moment to subscribe. Just click on the lit red button as well as the gray bell. Why the bell? Well, it will let you know every time we post a new video. 9. The Robbery. Lanius, Lind, Deverell, and McCourt headed to the Nash residence before Holmes made it back from his last trip to check the unlocked door. Holmes did not stick around for the robbery itself, but as the gang's car passed, he rolled down his window and said, "It's time. Get him, boys," and smiled as he raised his fist. According to Mike Sager, who did an article for Rolling Stone in 1989, once the group gained entry, they acted as if they were the police and ran into Gregory Dials, who was Nash's 300-pound bodyguard as he was bringing a tray to Nash in his room. Caught off guard, the gang was able to handcuff Dials, but a gun went off in the process. The bullet grazed Dials' back, and Eddie Nash, who was in fear of his life, asked to pray for his children. Nash's wish was not granted, but he wasn't killed despite being robbed, scared and humiliated. The gang made it out with a shocking take of over $300,000 between the stolen cash, drugs, jewelry, and weapons. 10. The Gullible Kingpin. Okay, so let's just say Holmes was really close to Nash, which is how the story goes. John Holmes was also in over his head with debt owed to Nash. It was obvious that Holmes was strung out pretty bad to everybody that knew him. Holmes had even acted as a go-between by selling Nash some of the weapons stolen by the Wonderland gang. Nash was also described as being very paranoid around this time, as he had been on a 10-day bender himself. Holmes claimed that he even had second thoughts while he was spending the $400 with Nash, and mentioned the gang, but that Nash was so out of it that he didn't understand anything. It would seem as though Nash's paranoia would have picked up on the gang being mentioned and the fact that Holmes came by 2 to 3 times in the same day. Another mystery is that the unlocked door was never checked by Dials or Nash. It's shocking that Eddie Nash was really that gullible, or was he? 11. A half-baked plan. The Wonderland gang thought Holmes had a plan. Why they would believe that robbing the biggest Hollywood kingpin of that era is shocking. David Lind later testified that he was never told who they were robbing, although he was there when the plan was originally discussed by the 7 people allegedly involved. The group included John Holmes, Ron Lanius, David Lind, Tracy McCourt, Billy Deverell, Joy Miller, and Lind's girlfriend Barbara Richardson. Holmes drew a floor plan of the Nash house and was given $400 to spend with Eddie while setting up a way for the gang to enter the residence. He was gone for hours and had spent all of the money up on drugs, but it left the sliding glass door ajar for the gang. When Holmes finally returned to the Wonderland town home, everyone was too loaded to go. This again shows just how much of the insane plan was fueled by the group's habit. The group made 2 false runs before they actually followed through with the robbery, shown here in Wonderland, with 12 connections. The connections and string of events that led to the 4 on the floor murders is probably what is most shocking aside from the actual crime scene. John Holmes was at the center of both plots. Holmes most likely wouldn't have known the Wonderland gang or Eddie Nash had his 13-inch penis never been discovered. However, since his package was discovered, he went heavy into the drug scene. Holmes needed money to support his habits once his career began to fail, and he became a delivery boy alternating between both Wonderland and Nash. He also had forced his girlfriend into working the streets to get him money. He was indebted to Eddie Nash, who had bailed him out following an arrest. He was also in deep debt with the Wonderland gang. Holmes' plan to get back in good with the gang and get his hands on some easy cash was to set up Eddie Nash, shown here in Wonderland. 13. John Johnny Wadd Holmes. John Holmes was actually born John Cutis Estes in 1944. His dad was never around, so his mother changed his last name to Holmes when he was a child. He joined the army at 16 and married Sharon Jebanini when he returned in 1964. The couple had a simple life with ordinary jobs. That is, until Holmes' penis was discovered in the bathroom by an underground adult magazine photographer. This eventually led to his shocking connections between the Wonderland Gang and Eddie Nash. John Holmes' career had really taken off in the adult film industry by 1971 with his role as Detective Johnny Wad. Sharon stayed with him out of love, but was no longer interested in having an intimate relationship with Holmes. In 1976 he met 15-year-old Dawn Schiller, who became his girlfriend. Holmes was already edging toward his drug habit by then. His connections to Eddie Nash and the Wonderland Gang followed shortly after. 14. Adele Eddie Nash Nasrallah. Adele Nasrallah, who is best known as Eddie Nash, immigrated to the U.S. from Palestine in 1950. He started off by running a hot dog stand, and ended up running several nightclubs and restaurants in Los Angeles, making him one of the wealthiest and most powerful drug kingpins of Hollywood. Eddie Nash was also a habitual drug user. He wasn't the kind of person that you would want to mess with. Eddie often called Holmes his brother around guests, and loved showing off his friendship with the well-known adult film star. Eddie Nash was also known for his hospitality, and would usually give friends anything, but Holmes had worn out his welcome. This, however, did not mean that Eddie was willing to let someone set him up as Holmes did. It was really shocking that a gang of people actually thought they were slick enough to not only rob Nash, but humiliate him in his home as well. 15. The Wonderland Gang. The shocking thing about the Wonderland Gang was that the group actually conspired and carried out a robbery at the home of known kingpin Eddie Nash just a couple of days before the four-on-the-floor murders. Ronnie Ron Lanius, the leader, Tracy McCourt, William Billy Deverell, and his girlfriend Joy Miller, who was the leaseholder of the townhome, were the original four members of the gang. The Wonderland Gang was well known in Los Angeles for trafficking drugs, mostly cocaine, throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. All of the members were also addicts and had lengthy arrest records. The gang had also added robberies to their long list of crimes in order to fuel their need for more money and drugs. David Lynch knew Ron Lanius from prison and had joined up with the gang to help with the robberies and burglaries. Joy Miller and Billy Deverell were the only two members who lived at the residence on Wonderland Avenue. The other gang members were frequent house guests, as well as John Holmes, shown here played by Val Kilmer in Wonderland.